Good evening, everybody. Good afternoon. First of all, before we start, I would appreciate if everybody closes the mobile phones. לסגור את הטלפונים הסלולריים בבקשה, לכבות. I don't have one, so it's okay. I take great pleasure today to introduce you our distinguished speaker, Professor Anthony Cordesman, who holds the Alray Chair in Alray Aberg Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's the author of a wide range of reports on U.S. security policy, energy policy, and Middle East policy. Professor Cordesman formerly served as National Security Assistant to Senator John McCain of the Senate Armed Service Committee as Director of Intelligence Assessment in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and as a civilian assistant to the Deputy Secretary of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He has also served in other government positions, including at the Department of State, Department of Energy, and NATO International Staff. He has had numerous foreign assignments, including positions in Lebanon, Egypt, and Iran, and he has worked extensively in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. Professor Cordesman is also the author of more than 50 books, including a 4-volume series on the lessons of modern war. His most recent works include Iraq's Insurgency and the Road to Civil Conflict, which was published in 2007, Lessons of the 2006 Israeli-Hezbollah War, also in 2007, Iran's military forces and warfighting capabilities, also in 2007, Iraqi force development, also in 2007, and Salvaging American Defense, also in 2007. The title of today's talk would be The Military Balance of the Gulf, and I invite Professor Cordesman to deliver his speech. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming. Let me say that I'm going to talk about the balance in the Gulf from an American perspective. I think you have a fairly good picture of what it is like from an Israeli perspective. And I'm going to focus on Iran, but I should remind you that as I go through this briefing, Iran is not our central focus. We are fighting a war in Iraq. We are fighting a war in Afghanistan. There are significant differences in our perception of how serious the Iranian nuclear and missile threat from what I've heard here in Israel. We are dealing with the constant problem of Islamic, Sunni, Neo-Salafi extremism and terrorism in the Gulf region and around it. And this is a fundamentally different set of concerns and priorities. And it is sometimes difficult for people to remember that we have this set of broader strategic concerns and involvements. But it is a reality that we have to live with. Unfortunately, this blank slide, I'm just going to tell you what it shows, because it is a real problem when you talk about the military balance in the Gulf. It doesn't matter what survey you show. The United States at this point in time has to face the most serious problems in terms of Arab anger and distrust in more than 2 decades of polling. There are 3 major reasons for that distrust and anger. One is the U.S. military invasion of Iraq. One is the feeling that the United States has conducted the war on terrorism in ways which are anti-Arab and anti-Islamic. And the third is the United States alliance with Israel. It is irrelevant whether this is fair. One of the problems we face in dealing with this region is that military balances and the U.S. posture in this region are not dependent on some kind of popular vote, but they are dependent on popular perceptions to some degree, and frankly, visiting the Gulf, all of these issues, to a lesser degree or in different forms, are issues which you confront in dealing with Gulf militaries, Gulf regimes, and Gulf leaderships. They vary by country, but remember, when we talk about the balance, one key issue is not today. It's how does this evolve over time? What is our ability in terms of freedom of action? How much popular and regime support can we get in terms of the war on terrorism, or containing, deterring, or dealing with Iran? It is the issue of what happens almost regardless of how we leave Iraq. The balance, in many ways, is as much a matter of U.S. basing and power projection rights as any other factor. It is, what is the status of our access to Bahrain, which is where we have the Fifth Fleet? It is, what is our access to Qatar, which right now is critical in terms of air operations, because that is the only facility that is a land facility that gives us the mixture of command and control capabilities, operational capabilities for land-based bombers. You do not penetrate deeply into Iran as an American using fighter bombers. You do not operate off carriers. You use stealth aircraft, you use heavy earth penetrators, and these are land-based aircraft that do not have carrier capability. We need basing rights and access to the UAE. We need contingency facilities in Oman. We have 3 major facilities in Kuwait. And at least for the foreseeable future, if we have both our existing force presence in those facilities and the ability to surge in those facilities, in any conventional conflict, we have a decisive ability to deal with Iran. Having said that, let me talk about the military balance in the Gulf in 3 different ways: the conventional balance, the asymmetric balance, and the nuclear balance. Forgive me if I leave out issues like counterterrorism. Frankly, there are only so many subjects you can try to put into one brief and give people an opportunity to ask questions. Let me begin with the conventional balance, and let me make a point about Iran. There is a tendency to see Iran as some kind of emerging hegemon. At this point in time, Iran has an advantage, even over the southern Gulf states, in exactly 2 areas. One is a large amount of manpower, and the other is towed artillery. In terms of the manpower, one thing to remember is that almost all of the Gulf forces are deeply divided, have internal rivalries, and Iran is no exception. The Guard is emerging as, in many ways, the most influential and dominant force. For example, it took over basic operational control of the naval forces in the Gulf early this year, but there is certainly no doubt that there are divisions within it and within the elements. But Iran, in spite of rumor after rumor following the Iran-Iraq War, and those of you who were not there can have no idea of how devastating the Iraqi victories were to the Iranian military structure in 1988. There is still a debate among U.S. experts as to whether Iran's army and Revolutionary Guards lost 60% or 40% of their inventory of heavy armor in the climactic battles of that war. But I can tell you, having seen where that equipment was towed inside Iraq, what was interesting is how much of it did not have any combat damage and how much of it was rushed into the field without even being painted properly to have camouflage or desert coloring. This is also a force where if you talk about investment and spending, remember that for many of you, the bulk of its equipment are older than you are. In an era when advances in avionics, in guided weaponry, in command and control, in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, Iran is forced to rely on what could at best be described as a kludge of worn, obsolete, commercial, and limited amounts of modern equipment. And if you look at this spending profile over time, and it would be pointless to show Iran relative to the United States, the southern Gulf states, for all their defects, have been spending something on an order of 12 to 14 times as much on military forces as Iran has. If we look at the patterns of new arms imports, what is really striking is look at the Iran figure, which should be, I hope, in the far left-hand corner of this chart. It's negligible. There's been report after report in Janes and elsewhere of these massive Iranian arms imports, or of Iran producing large amounts of new military equipment in Iranian territory. Nobody has seen it arrive. Nobody has seen it in exercises. And the reality is an arms import report is accurate when it arrives and you have time to make use of it in training and conversion. The ratio of Gulf new arms orders is also a measure of modernization. Can the southern Gulf states use their forces effectively? It depends on the element. In general, the effectiveness is limited. But one thing is very clear, there's been massive modernization throughout the Gulf states, and when a state as Kuwait, as small as Kuwait, imports twice as much military equipment and technology as a state as large as Iran, you get an idea of the problems and limits. Now, these charts on comparative tank strength are remarkably flattering, but I had to do the best I could for Iran. If you look at their force, the bulk of it is early generation T-72s. These have not been upgraded. I can tell you from our own experience in the Gulf War that this tank lacked the fire control systems. It lacked anything like the armor that is necessary to achieve direct engagement at range. A lot of the other tanks shown here are tanks that were in Iran when I was in Iran, and that was a long, long time ago. Others were caught up in the Iran-Iraq War, and that is a problem with the inventory here. It isn't a matter of types alone. It's a matter of wear and sustainability. I won't take you through all of these measures. I'll leave them behind, but I do want to call your attention to the artillery strength. Iran's forces in the real world are not power projection forces. They are not maneuver forces. They are defensive forces designed to deal with invasion. They evolved in response to the fighting with Iraq, which was very narrow in terms of depth, even when Iran was on the offensive. And as a result, you have large amounts of towed artillery, large amounts of rockets. That is not supported by effective targeting, by effective command and control, or by the kinds of systems necessary to make use of modern firepower with precision. This is another side of the story. It isn't often shown on the balance. There's no question U.S. military forces, particularly land forces, are under strain. But this is ongoing modernization of the U.S. force, land, air, and Navy. You are talking not only about the most visible symbols on this chart, but massive advantages in intelligence and targeting systems, major advances in hard target killers, and radical changes coming in the level of precision and standoff kill capability. And also, to put this in perspective, this is the shifts going on in spite of the Iraq and the Afghan war. What you have as a lesson of these wars, difficult as it is to convert in wartime, a major increase in U.S. power projection capability in terms of ground force capability. Now, to go back to the local balance, look at the figure for Iran. In terms of numbers, it is still the largest air force, although it is a fraction of the size of the Saudi Air Force. But these numbers do not reflect the fact that only about a third of that large blue bar is anything other than a military parking lot. In general, when an aircraft isn't used at least once a year, it isn't usable. Sortie rates are minimal. The ability to use aircraft without cannibalizing them is extremely dependent on supply at any given time. Supply, when it is often dependent on illegal imports, becomes erratic. I see a lot of people here in military uniform. You know what it's like to get 70% of what you need to make a piece of equipment operational. It isn't operational. And when we look at quality, there are only two lines on this assessment of the Iranian balance that are relevant: the MiG-29 and the Su-24. The F-14 might be modified for long-range delivery, but it has not had operational Phoenix missiles, which were the key element of its air-to-air combat design since the fall of the Shah. Efforts to rig Hawk surface-to-air missiles to a combat fighter are interesting technically, but scarcely a major threat. In contrast, this time it's useful to look at the Saudi bar, particularly the number of F-15s, because these have been operated with considerable effectiveness. If you look at the UAE, this is scarcely the largest air force in the world, but with the delivery of the F-16 Block 60, an aircraft which I think some Israeli pilots would like to have, you can't totally dismiss this kind of air capability. And training levels actually worked out fairly well. In terms of Navy, the basic surface platforms predated my arrival in Iran, which means many of them are deliveries anywhere from the 1950s to the 1960s. You can't modernize a ship that old. There is no way to re-rig, create an efficient platform for battle management, alter the sensors, except to take it back to the shipyard and rebuild it from the ground up. And frankly, to do it would cost more than a new ship. They have modified these. There are some successful developments in terms of anti-ship missiles. I don't want to minimize what they can do. They do have modern submarines, 3 of them. Out of these, they have become more or less operational on a regular level. There are still some practical problems in getting them to work, particularly during given parts of the year. If you look at the Gulf navies, they are far more modern, far better equipped, have far more weaponry. With the exception of Oman, however, shall we say that they are in a state of early development. That's about the most flattering description that I can find. One thing I should note, however, is that in terms of asymmetric warfare, patrolling, the kinds of things which secure the Gulf, we don't need these forces to be able to operate as if this was a major conventional exchange with us. They need to take up area defense, surveillance, to be able to defend against lower level threats, to work with us on a bilateral basis. And that is one of the things that's often missing from this assessment of conventional forces. These platforms can have more than one purpose. And in a lot of the exercises and training, that's what they do. They don't sail out to fight the Iranian Navy as if this was the Battle of Trafalgar. it's irrelevant. That isn't the kind of combat that really occurs today. Now, frankly, when we look at reality here, we face, as you face, but in a very different form, the problem of asymmetric warfare and what might be described as wars of intimidation. What do I mean by that? I think all of you know what asymmetric warfare is, and I'll try to get into some of the details in a moment. But if you are in the Gulf and you visit Gulf countries, you become aware that in many cases, the issue is not that Iran provides active support to some element that is hostile to the regimes of a southern Gulf state. It is its capability, its perceived ability to harass or interdict or affect the security of Gulf waters or Gulf coasts that is the primary problem in terms of security for the southern Gulf states. They certainly monitor Iran's missile development, they monitor its nuclear dimension, but neither in terms of public perceptions nor regime perceptions do they see this as an existential threat, nor do they see this as an urgent threat. Will they react to it if it materializes over time? Yes. Do they see this as something which affects them in the next 12 months, or 2 years, or 3 years? By and large, no. And the fact that there is a handful of noisy analysts in what passes for strategic studies institutes in the southern Gulf does not mean that leaderships pay any attention to them. In some ways, these have become sort of status symbols along with very advanced weapons purchases. You can't be a Gulf leader anymore unless you have a small strategic studies group. In terms of tangible threats, this list is scarcely one Israelis need to see. You live with it. It is, however, something we face in Iraq. We face it to a lesser degree in Afghanistan. And the Gulf states know the risk, particularly from what happened to Bahrain early after the Khomeini regime came to power. When you look at tangible examples, you have your own in this region. This is a list of the issues we have faced basically since 1987. There's an important part of this list. There's never been a meaningful clash or incident, with the exception possibly of the Al-Khobar Towers incident, where Iran has really been able to achieve very much. The pressure has been there, the threats have been there, but by and large, when it comes down to internal threats in the Gulf, the real problem is a different one. The real problem is much more terrorism, it is much more neo-Salafi groups, it is not Iran. And I think when you look at the capabilities we have seen from particularly Iranian activity inside Iraq, no one could minimize that. A very limited technology of specific elements for improvised explosive devices. Small, precisely machined discs that can be used for shape charges and anti-armored weapons have been one of the key killing mechanisms producing U.S. casualties. We have seen, as you have seen, they've delivered new rocket launchers, they've delivered mortars. The markings on them make it very clear where they came from and in some cases when they were produced. I should note, because there are some people in the U.S. who grossly exaggerate this, that from the viewpoint of, say, General Petraeus, from the viewpoint of General Odierno, from the viewpoint of the people who are operating in Iraq, this has been much more a matter of limited harassment, a matter of leverage, a matter of opportunism, than a serious problem as a campaign. And it's varied by cycle. The U.S. commander of the operational forces in Iraq just yesterday noted that there was another decline in the level of Iranian activity precisely at the time the Iranians are out there firing missiles, not only surface-to-surface missiles as they did yesterday, but 6 new anti-ship tests, which they did today. Now, looking down the list, the primary issue we see in terms of confrontation, other than support and weapons flows and training of Iraqi militias, and to some extent Al-Qaeda in Iraq, because there is a clear level of transfer of IED technology to them, is really the Naval Guards branch. And this can't come as a shock to any of you who have looked at this issue. Some of this is minor. It is not the kind of threat that you really have to worry about. Some of it presents a problem in terms of a threat known as swarming. If you are attacked by a very wide range of short-range or small systems at once, trying to saturate the kind of coverage you have, at the same time you're engaged in conventional military operations, there is always the possibility of vulnerability. And one of the problems we've had since we used to practice this with a friendly Iran back in the early 70s is you constantly have to adjust U.S. combat profiles to deal with this risk. The point I would make is, regardless of some of the press reports I've seen, running worst-case exercises to see how bad it can get and then reacting to them does not mean that you face a critical or serious threat. Could they close the Gulf? Potentially for a week or so. Could they harass the Gulf? Yes, that they could do on a prolonged basis. And when a single word from an Israeli minister can raise oil prices by $7 a barrel, harassment really matters. This is something which can take the form of oil spills, of floating mines, or a whole variety of low-level techniques. Let me just point out, however, asymmetry works in 2 ways. If you push it too hard, you have to react. If you react as the United States, you react rather decisively. And Iran has to be extraordinarily careful about guessing at the balance between annoyance and retaliation. This is something which is often lost in looking at the process of asymmetry. Now, these are the elements with which they could close the Gulf. I'll be happy to discuss the details, but it's a bit technical. The one point I want to make, and I wasn't clear whether this slide would come out, is there are people obsessed with the Strait of Hormuz. Look, some of you may, over the years, have at least once in your life broken a bottle. How many times did you break it at the neck? It doesn't matter where you break the bottle. And in dealing with the Gulf, you have a wide range of offshore, coastal, and nearshore targets. They don't just include oil, they include critical targets like desalination and electric plants. Defense of Gulf waters and Gulf facilities, tanker flows and shipment flows into the Gulf is a critical issue. And you have to understand something about energy. This Strait of Hormuz today, people can debate the precise amount of product that goes through. It's about 16 billion barrels a day of gas, product, and crude oil. Current estimates indicate those shipments will close to double by 2030. There's all kinds of rhetoric about reductions in U.S. energy import dependence. The fact is we just issued a U.S. government report on this called the Annual Energy Outlook. It projects almost no reduction in import dependence through 2030. And unfortunately, the debate is framed in ways which are misleading. Like you, we occasionally import things from Asia. Some of those things tend to be called cars or other items called steel. When that comes, the energy used to produce those is increasingly imported oil from the Gulf. We are dependent not simply on our own imports, but those of Europe, Asia, a global economy. The chances of reducing strategic dependence on the Gulf are essentially zero, barring the invention of an energy technology which no one can even guess at this point in time. All of you, basically, probably even the youngest of you, will be towards the end of your careers before this changes at the earliest date. And we have to look down the line at this balance in terms of 20-year to 30-year increments, not matters of today or tomorrow. Now, in terms of planning for asymmetric warfare, I think you know the Israeli side. This is, in rough terms, the U.S. side. A lot of it is dependent on trying to improve cooperation, to reduce dependence on U.S. forces. But the fact is, when push comes to shove, what you find is an almost constant effort to figure out how to deal with every conceivable Iranian attack as if you did not have significant Allied support. And the most difficult problems do not occur at the higher levels of conflict. They occur at lower levels of sustained conflict when Iran uses proxies, when it tries to work with local movements, where it is very, very difficult to escalate or react decisively against a known target set when you're dealing with a political or an ideological process. And those of you who have dealt with Hezbollah and Hamas and other movements have a fairly good idea of what I'm talking about. Now let me shift to the nuclear dimension, and let me just say here a couple of things. First, there's a lot of confusion about the U.S. NIE. It was rushed out, I think not well. People are obsessed with the two-page summary of a document that was over 160 pages long with over 400 pages of support, and they've tried to parse out every word in that two-page document as if they could find some mystical insight into U.S. estimates. It doesn't work that way. Let me also note that since that document was issued, the Director of National Intelligence has provided several statements talking about how serious the Iranian nuclear threat is and that it is a remaining and serious issue. Since that document was issued, we have seen at least 2 new types of Iranian centrifuges, possibly 4. We have seen new data indicating that the AQ-Khan network may have provided a sophisticated weapons design to the Iranians, among others. We have seen more evidence relating to the weaponization of missile warheads. Now, that may sound like we agree that this is a deeply pessimistic effort. Our timing is about 3 years different from some Israeli experts. And in fact, the Assistant Secretary of State, William Burns, discussed this in broad terms, I believe, yesterday, wasn't it, Anne? First, Iran's nuclear enrichment activities remain crude and primitive. They remain dependent, at least to the extent that we have any knowledge of what is on at Natanz, at very low levels of enrichment. There is no sustained centrifuge operation of the kind necessary to produce fissile material quickly. It is obvious that they have very serious development and engineering problems still to solve. That does not mean they will not get there. It does not mean that this threat can be disregarded. I'm not saying that for a moment. But the fact is, our estimates are twofold here. It's if any of the things they have declared are real, we probably have somewhere between 2011 to 2015 before they get a device. But this map only shows you a handful of facilities. Over the years, various sources that are unclassified have identified more than 23 complexes in Iran that have some tie to nuclear weapons. These are large, visible targets. The most attractive one, the one that is generally seen as slowing things down, is attacking the centrifuge complex at Natanz. It is today operating about 3,000, or hosting, because most of them aren't operational, IR-1 centrifuges. We have now seen the IR-2 and the IR-3. We have seen a cooled version of the IR-2 and a possible larger centrifuge. Why is this so important? Why bother you with all this technical detail? Because every US model of centrifuge proliferation before the Natanz complex focused on small, dispersed facilities, essentially a shell game that we call folded centrifuges. One of the oddities here is if Iran persists in bringing online the IR-1s in Natanz, what is today a low-value target will become steadily more valuable over time. If Iran shifts to folded centrifuges, striking Natanz will not have much impact. If by striking Natanz you press Iran into going to dispersed higher capacity centrifuges, you take what in many ways is an inefficient effort and you risk speeding them up, not in getting their first weapon, but getting significant numbers of weapons for a nuclear force. I say this not because there's any certainty here, because I know what Israeli intelligence knows, or that this is based on some subtle assessment of US intelligence sources. It isn't. But I can't conceive of anything more dangerous than thinking in 12-month time horizons without thinking about alternatives and without estimating the real level of technology and what Iran can do over time. We have had that problem. I would hope that you don't have it. Let me also note, just to provide you a picture of what I was talking about, this is the entrance to the facility at Natanz. It was deliberately designed to sort of minimize the profile, but long before the MEK let us know of its existence, you could see the down ramp. This is smaller than the entry parking lot to the building we just came to. This is what it looks like from the surface. Really kind of a large warehouse, just one more facility. Unlike Iraq, not pretentious, not hidden in the middle of the desert, just sort of off the road. That's a commercial road going by it. Limited security. The problem for hitting it, you can knock out the entrance. Anybody can do that. But what really counts is that desert in the background. That's where the underground facility is. It's designed for a capacity of 38,000 centrifuges. You may or may not be able to knock it out with a hard target killer you can put on a fighter bomber. If you do knock it out, you may knock out part of it. Again, you have a facility so large that in some ways it's a shell game, although I would suspect by now that Israel, like the United States, has a fairly good idea of where the centrifuges are. There's another issue here too. You're getting all kinds of estimates of how soon can they get the nuclear weapon. What nuclear weapon? One problem that people keep looking at, and those of you who are in the strategic analysis, the political analysis side of this, need to remember, having a crude device is not having a deliverable weapon. Having fissile material does not mean you've tested. Having a failed or fractional test does not mean you know enough to build a bomb. And for those of you who have heard that physics students can design effective nuclear weapons, anybody could probably make a gun device do something. Every time anybody has tried to get even teams of skilled physics students to come close to an implosion device, they haven't come close. And the reason is not so much the technical design, but the fact that this is more than 90% engineering practice. It's materials. It's the actual systems integration. So the theory is cheap and easy. The practice is simply incredibly difficult. Again, with missiles, let me make the same point. I was kind of interested to read in some of the papers today that Iran had tested a missile with a range of 2,000 kilometers. The nominal estimate we use is 1,250 kilometers. The problem we have is that A, we're not even sure yet what they'd really tested by way of a Shahab 3. If it was yet another version, as people have announced, it will be the interesting example of a country which have never tested the same version of a ballistic missile twice at anything approaching practical range. Let me say the chances of being able to use a missile with anything more than the most vague counter-area capability that you have tested exactly once is negligible even compared to Saddam Hussein's Scud force. We need to be far more realistic about this. Will they get there? Yes, they will. Are they anything like ready at an operational level? No, they're not. Are they headed for more developed missiles and more advanced missiles? Are they looking at solid fuel? Yes. One other point I would make to all of you, we're not going to design a missile of this type that can't hit Israel. But if I were you, particularly if you have any professional interest, ignore every range figure you ever see until somebody actually shows you they fired it at range with the warhead they're going to use. One of the threats here is not that these missiles have very long range, but they'll put a very heavy and more effective warhead on it. And that's why when you look at a lot of the military literature outside the classified area, it's meaningless. Until you know the warhead configuration, talking about range is meaningless. Similarly, the same is true of CEP and accuracy. The Scuds work. The Scud B particularly is a very effective system. It took the Soviets about 170 firings to determine the actual accuracy and reliability of the system and calibrate it against its real-world errors. And let me also note that if you only have a few nuclear weapons, you really want to know it works, you really want to know it's reliable, and you really want to know where it goes. And when you see figures like circular error of probability, remember the definition. Until it is actually fired, and fired often enough within its engineering, with the warhead it will actually use, that is an engineering guesstimate. And it's a peculiar guesstimate. It tells you the accuracy of where half the missiles go. When you put a nuclear bomb on a missile, it is incumbent on you to know where the other half are going to end up. It also assumes that the missile works perfectly in every aspect of its design and is perfectly targeted. Some of you are in military uniform. You may not understand the full technical background of what I've just said, but how often has the word perfect been operational for 24 hours in your life as a serving military officer? Now let me make a few other points. I've talked to you, and I think this is very important. I don't believe if what Iran wants to do at all of the potential cost, whether it is your preventive strike, our preventive strike, sanctions, or diplomacy, you can stop it from getting some level of nuclear device. You can wait till it deploys. You can deny it delivery capability. You can deny it large overt facilities. But one thing you have to be very careful is to react to reality and not react to suspicion. You also, and these are just a list of the various decisions, and I won't walk you through them, but remember a couple of things that Israel now has to address just as we do. Let's say Iran does move toward nuclear weapons and does get them on missiles or a delivery system. At least for a long time, it will probably have only the ability to produce limited implosion weapons. Is that not an existential weapon? Of course it would be if what you're talking about is repeated successful strikes on Israel's urban complexes. The 20 kilotons is not a boosted weapon of 100 kilotons or more, or a fusion weapon, and I think it is reasonable to assume that Israel may have those. This chart of why yield matters, the difference in terms of effectiveness and lethality is essentially the difference between the second set of bars for Iran and the highest set of bars for Israel. Again, I want to stress the damage or risk of an Iranian nuclear strike on Tel Aviv, both in terms of prompt kill, which are the red areas here, or the fallout areas shown there. Let me note this is the worst case which cannot occur. There is exactly no case where you can use fallout as a weapon against Israel, where your weather models permit you to take optimal use of fallout against Israel's urban complexes. But that doesn't really matter. It is a devastating attack. But let me note something about Iran that's missing, and it affects extended deterrence. This is Iran's high-value population centers, but these are a little misleading. If you take out 5, the economic coherence of the country and its character as a Persian state disappears. If you take out Tehran, Iran is an over-centralized structure in economy, administration, and population. One city for Iran is almost as important to Iran as one city is to Israel. And the difference between 1 megabyte, or 1 megaton, I should say, is immense. But Israel, early on, given the generation and source of some of its missile developments, particularly the French designs on which some of them are based, and years of evolution, can put down different kinds of target mixes. The best way to deal with nuclear targeting, if what you want to do is to deter a nation by threatening its existence, is to put down multiple hits over time, not all at once. There are real advantages, frankly, to not committing fratricide because the secondary effects of these weapons go far beyond these prompt kill circles if you do it at 1 hour, 2 hour, or 3 hour intervals. Fallout over Tehran, the nature of Tehran and several other Iranian cities makes it vastly more attractive to attack them with fallout rather than prompt kill capabilities. Now this is something that I think for those of you who have not grown up in the Cold War or ever seen a nuclear exchange model is probably about as horrifying a conceptual structure as you can find. But let me note, unless you believe that Iran is going to remain or is or ever has been under totally irrational leadership, the structure of deterrence here is a subject that everyone has to consider. And I am not simply talking about Israeli strikes, I am talking about US strikes and about the pattern and the intermix of negotiation, deterrence, containment, active prevention. All of these options are on the table. They remain on the table almost indefinitely into the future. And I think one of the difficulties here is we are going to have to rethink this problem out over time. And let me just make one other point. Again, any of you who are under 30 have to consider, where could Iran be over the next 10 to 20 years? I don't want to get into the changes taking place in the accessibility to nuclear weapons technology or fissile material production. Some of you have the technical base to make your own guesses. But it isn't going to be tomorrow what it is today. Any action you take is not going to be like Iraq. This country has the technology and production base to reconstitute capabilities without imports. And every time it reconstitutes, it will modernize and improve. The other factor down here, remember, this is a chemical power. It is one where our Director of National Intelligence has cited the biological risk. These figures are Russian. They are originally classified. They show you the amount of material through optimal dissemination it takes to achieve a 50% death rate over the area shown. People talk about nuclear, they ignore the other aspects of weaponry. Basically speaking, producing advanced biological weapons, regrettably, at least for a state, with advances in food processing, pharmaceuticals, and genetic engineering, is not a genie you can put back in the bottle. If what you want is an Iran which can't create a devastating attack, you can't get there. There's no inspection regime, there are no basic controls on the supplies. If you push them out of nuclear, you have no ability to constrain them in another dimension. Thinking strategically, you have to look beyond the nuclear balance and the missile balance, and remember, these are far easier to develop and deploy in covert terms, and they are far harder to identify or fingerprint in terms of source. These are realities you simply cannot back away from. Nothing that happens can alter the pace of this particular risk. So let me conclude there. I've tried to take you through 3 areas. Any of you in the military know how many things I had to omit. I hope some of them are areas you've not been exposed to before. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Cordesman, for a richly informative lecture. There's a lot of data, a lot of new points of view, and I guess we can take about 15 minutes of 10-15 minutes of questions. So, please.
Would like to. Yeah. Why don't I just go ahead and, please, sir. Does he need to wait for the mic or anything?
Can you give us a rough assessment of the military intelligence facilities of Iran?
I can give you a rough assessment, and I'm not going to. And only a rough assessment, but unfortunately I've had enough background briefings, so this is not a subject I can get into. I do think, however, it is dangerous to assume because they don't have the most advanced technical assets, they do not have a very good collection capability. What I can tell you is that they do a great deal of translation and collection of Western literature. They make an excellent job of exploiting open source literature, and often we give ourselves far more credit in the value of secrets than the value of secrets really deserve. Yes.
You mentioned the Iran-Iraq war, and the Iraqis towing away undamaged Iranian tanks. Did I understand that correctly, that the Iranian tank crews abandoned their tanks on the field?
Yes, very much so. And there were hundreds of them, and not just tanks. Artillery, there were BMPs, other pieces of equipment. It was almost incredible to visit some of the areas where Iraq had towed those systems outside Baghdad. It looked like the kind of parking lot that the largest mall in the United States could only dream of. Yes, and back.
Thinking about development and the operationality of surface-to-surface missiles reminds me of, I think it was December 1987, when Iraq first announced the firing of Hussein missile, 600 kilometers missile range. And then everybody asked whether it is operational and tended to underestimate it. And 2 months afterwards, it was the end of February 1988, Iraq started firing a total of 189, I think, Al-Hussein missiles, including also Al-Abbas with its 900 kilometers towards Iranian cities in what was called the last phase of the War of the Cities, and it was the last phase of the Iran-Iraq War, to be followed by attacks, Iraqi attacks, and then bringing the war to an end.
Well, let me just correct something very quickly. When you say everybody, you mean a bunch of newspaper commentators. Well, let me say that it wasn't certainly.
I was in the army.
Yes, well, you probably were not doing the intelligence estimates in the United States or tracking Iraqi telemetry.
So it took them 2 months to make that thing operational.
No, it didn't. That's simply not true. When you announce a test, particularly in those days, you don't necessarily have to announce every test. When you are essentially using an extension of an existing device rather than producing it yourself, and you are importing key proven components, you're operating in a different climate. The ability to fire a booster from one place to another with accuracies that you can't determine within a matter of kilometers is not the same as reliably having a mature program you can target. When you don't have to put any kind of damage assessment and you're firing into urban areas, and you don't have to record how many of the things you fire actually land, you run into some very interesting situations. Now, there were no major misfires in the limited number they fired against Israel, but that was substantially later. So, frankly, the data are a great deal more complex than this, and you get some very strange interpretations of the War of the Cities, depending on who it is and which Iranian you're talking to. Initially, I guess, as would be the case anywhere in the world, like the initial strikes that the Germans made on London, people panicked, they overreacted. As it became clearer what the limits were, it also became clearer that people didn't necessarily behave as the civil defense program should, and as you moved down that program, when people were getting up on the roof to see what was happening that night, you weren't quite achieving the terror effects that people might have liked inside of Baghdad. It's also important to remember this particular exchange worked in two directions, and that the Iranians originally had a considerable advantage because their target launch capabilities were much closer to Baghdad. With the exception of one strike, and this is mildly relevant, out of all the missiles Iran ever fired they hit exactly one high-value target in Iraq in the course of the entire war. Out of all the missiles that Iraq fired against Iran, they hit exactly 0 high-value targets. So again, a little perspective is useful here. You'll have to speak loudly, sir. I can't hear you.
Could you refer to the Southern Caucasus and in Azerbaijan and Georgia as the key elements in potential involvement of the U.S. against Iran?
No. No, it just isn't a key element. Look, if you're going to do anything against Iran, you're talking about stealth aircraft with significant numbers of new types coming online. You're talking about cruise missiles with your primary launch platform being ships. If you're talking about a more complex, intense war, you still are going to not try to deal with all of Iran. When it comes down to complex refueling and basing profiles, you may have a wider variety of attacks, but they're not going to be centered around one spot, and particularly that one. Yes?
Also, of your description, if you have the access to advise to the Israeli leadership, what would be the top 3 or top 5 advice on how to crystallize a policy toward this region?
The region?
I think the threats.
How many lectures are you prepared to pay for? And how long will the audience stay here?
The highlights.
No, that's the problem. I can tell you, one of the greatest difficulties you have is sort of reducing complex strategic problems to sound bites and slogans. I think that some things are fairly obvious. Whatever you do in the case of Iran, if it is based on the idea that we have to do something now because we have to do it now, rather than thinking out the strategic consequences, it didn't exactly work in Lebanon, and I wouldn't advise that you do it when you're dealing with an opponent that's moving toward nuclear weapons. You, I think, have to face the problem that regardless of what goes on, you're going to have to think about deterrence, you're going to have to think about how you work with other states. You have the difficulty of really trying to find a way to work without working openly on this issue, realizing that some of the states that on the one hand are potential threats are also potential allies in the Gulf. You have to figure out what kind of posture you'd really like us to have in the region. I think that when it comes down to asymmetric warfare, I'm not in a position to do anything other than say that the basic changes I've seen that are public, reacting to the struggle with the Hezbollah, seem to be very productive. But quite frankly, I've seen the U.S. go through moments where it thought it could be over-reliant on air power, where it talked about reducing the role of ground troops for surgical air power strikes. It didn't work for us either. The uncertainty of joint arms, of maintaining high levels of readiness, of constant technical innovation, of understanding that today's techniques diminish over time, all of these issues we both learned in different ways in the last several years. In terms of the peace process, the whole Arab-Israeli issue, let me go back to a conversation I had with Zev Shif just about 2 years after Oslo. He made a point to me which I think still strikes home. You may think we are trading territory for peace, but just watch. We are trading terrorism for settlements. That is a point that you have to consider, I think, in far more depth and with far more realism if you really want to move forward and you do not wish to have a constant level of confrontation. And having been here in July of 1967, as well as in Jordan and Egypt, and having had everybody tell me, well, it was a terrible or a wonderful war, but at least we know what the peace settlement will be and we will achieve it in the next few years, I think that you have to look down the line and consider exactly where you are going. In terms of technological modernization, you have to make fundamentally different cost trade-offs than we do. And I'm not in a position, frankly, to advise you. In terms of the war on terrorism, I think I would give not the people in Israeli intelligence or the IDF I talk to, but people outside them, as I would Americans, the same advice. It's interesting to have ideological studies. It's interesting to turn this into a constant reference to what has happened in Islam since its generation, or at least in the last 200 years. But be very careful. You are talking about specific movements in specific countries, elements that have specific levels of international operations. And if this is going to actually be countered, you not only have to focus on the individual movement and the way it's really working, but you have to accept the fact you're not going to solve the problem by transforming the Middle East from the outside about slogans about democracy or changes in governance or universal values. You have to make not only hard choices but realistic ones. If it takes 20 years to achieve that kind of reform in the West when somebody wants it, it isn't going to come in 20 months in the Arab world when they don't.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Cordesman, for I would say, eye-opening lecture. Since everybody was quiet, I can say that everybody was listening. It usually doesn't happen every lecture that we have. I would also like to thank you again for taking the time. I know you had a very pressed and tight itinerary while in Israel, and especially in Haifa. Professor Cordesman had just another lecture in Haifa elsewhere, so we thank you for taking the time and the energy. I would like to thank Ms. Ann Walter from the Public Relations Office of the American Embassy at Tel Aviv. I would also like to thank Ms. Ella Bash, the administrator of the Ezri Center, and Mr. Roy Kahanovich, the IT manager of the center, for organizing this event. And I want to thank you everybody for coming, and see you in other lectures. Thank you very much.